it's Katey, and today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about my changing tastes in tarot, or my shift in the sorts of decks that I'm drawn to and that I feel really enrich my practice at this point. If you've been following my channel, maybe you've noticed this shift, but certainly if you go back a year or two or three, I definitely was more attracted to cutesy, kind of not modern, basically. I did not like modern decks, basically. I didn't like my decks to look like the real world. Any deck that did look too much like that, I was pretty much automatically turned off. Kind of the only exception was the Fountain Tarot, but that almost to me feels like futuristic and ethereal rather than literally our world today. But for the most part, you know, decks like the Hezicos Tarot, which is a fae pastel coloured world, and even decks like the Watersprite, which definitely don't really feel rooted in a specific time in history, but feel old-timey and a little bit fantasy-esque, I suppose, just not real. They're quite cartoony, the people don't look especially realistic, and they're just really, really cute and pretty. And I certainly did have an aversion to contemporary looking decks that depicted relatively realistic people in a relatively realistic modern world. I just wasn't attracted to that, and oftentimes, even when the art style or the colours or whatever, when I might have been attracted to that, if it was too modern, something just kind of really turned me off. Even in decks that I really, really love, like the Clover Tarot, which was given to me as a gift, which was amazing, I'd been kind of wanting this deck on and off for a very long time. I loved the colours, I loved the artwork, but there were a couple of cards that always kind of made me doubt. One is the Eight of Wands. There's a plane in this card. Wasn't a fan. And another that particularly I didn't like was the Five of Wands. There was something, I saw this card and I was like, nah. And I don't know what it is. I think what I've put it down to, and the best I can come up with, is that I think previously I needed a layer of fantasy in order to get into my readings. I think I needed to kind of, I very actively practice, you know, like a suspension of disbelief. I very actively choose to not question. In the situation of a reading, I just let myself trust and believe that tarot works and that my experience is really valid in the moment. Whether or not I intellectually think that outside of that reading doesn't matter. In that moment, tarot is 100% real. And maybe I needed that element of fantasy to my decks in order to kind of allow that even more. And bringing in any hint of reality kind of maybe busted me out of that little bubble I created for myself. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but that's the best explanation I can come up with as to why I had such an aversion to contemporary modern day imagery in my decks. And I've been trying to work out where this started for me, because obviously, as I've mentioned, I have had the Fountain Tarot for a while, but that kind of more felt like the exception rather than the rule. And the World Spirit I've had for a little while, that's a little bit newer to me, and it describes itself as a modern version of the traditional tarot. And I can certainly appreciate where that's coming from, because this deck appreciates diversity a lot more and represents diversity a lot more than some of our older decks do. But the imagery itself still feels not real world. Like, there's a lot of imagery of gods. It feels quite old-timey in terms of what the people are wearing and doing. Like, this doesn't look or feel like the world that I inhabit and am, you know, familiar with. So even though this deck describes itself as modern, it didn't feel modern or contemporary. It didn't feel like the world that I know and that I inhabit. It didn't feel like it was a challenge to the sorts of decks that I'm drawn to, basically, is what I'm saying. I think the first deck that I feel really started this kind of shift off for me was the Sasuraibito Tarot. And this was a deck that kind of similarly to the Clover Tarot, there were a few cards in that deck that really put me off. There were a few cards that to varying degrees I didn't immediately like because of their kind of more contemporary spin. But the absolute, like the one that was just like kind of a deal breaker for me at the time was the Emperor. This business suit just did nothing for me. I was just like, when I saw this, I was like, no, okay. As much as I liked all the other imagery and as much as I liked the colors and a lot of what I was seeing, this card kind of pulled the plug for me. I was done. But in the end, something did make me get this deck. And primarily the reason I got it was out of curiosity and because I wanted the Mesquite Tarot, and you know, I had to pay a set amount for shipping, and if I got a few decks, that made that shipping feel more worthwhile. And I knew it was a popular deck, so if I got it and brought it into Australia, it would be easy for me to trade if I didn't, you know, kind of connect with it. But I was surprised almost immediately by just how well this deck read for me. I absolutely fell in love with it. It was hard for me to put this deck down. I was obsessed with it, really. And at some point while working with this deck, I grew to appreciate the Emperor card and the readability of that card, how accessible that very simple imagery was, and how easy that was to read. And I think as a result of having that experience, I opened myself up to the idea of the Next World Tarot. Now this was a deck, I remember seeing it on Kickstarter, and I'm not a huge fan of Kickstarter, but I do remember I was really excited by the concept, but I wasn't sure about the artwork because it's quite busy and I was concerned that I would have trouble seeing it. But also beyond that, that modern take again, like this was on Kickstarter quite a while ago. So I liked it, I appreciated it, I was glad it was going to exist, but I just kind of thought, not for me. You know, cards like this is a very, you know, you could meet this person today. But this was a deck that I just I wrote off for me. And I think at the time it wasn't for me. I think if I had have gotten it then, I wouldn't have connected with it. I'm not saying, I suppose this video isn't about me saying that, oh, I was wrong in, you know, cutting myself off from all this opportunity. What I'm saying is that something in me has shifted in order, basically, that these decks are now where I'm at, are now what are right for me, whereas they weren't before. And that change is interesting to me. Like, this is just so not the sort of thing I would have been drawn to before, even though it's beautiful and I love the artwork. I think it's lovely. The colors are beautiful. They tell a story. I just wouldn't have been, you know, really, I wouldn't have been drawn to reading with this. I don't think I would have gotten a lot out of it in terms of what I was trying to do with my readings. And perhaps it is that I would have been kind of brought out of my little bubble of fantasy that allowed me to experience tarot in a certain way that was necessary for me at the time. I think now I've had so many experiences with tarot that I'm just okay with the fact that maybe I don't understand how it works, but it works for me, and that's okay. Whereas I think I had to work a lot harder at achieving that disbelief, or that suspension of disbelief. Now I don't have to work as hard, and so perhaps that's part of the reason that it's okay, that I'm okay seeing things that look a lot more familiar to me in terms of the real world, that don't have to have this veil of fantasy over them anymore. But I suppose with the Next World and the Sasuraibito, there still is an element of unrealness to them. The Sasuraibito is still very colourful, and there is an element of cartoony fantasy to it. Doesn't all look like the real world, basically. And the Next World, the element of fantasy is kind of like a dystopian near future. So even though it looks very much like our world, it looks like a little bit in the future. So it's still what I would consider a very contemporary deck and imagery and the people represented. But I can see where there's still like a hint of fantasy associated with these two decks. But I think you would be hard pressed to argue that there is any fantasy associated with the Urban Tarot. Now this is a deck that is very new to me. Haven't really worked with it at all yet. But the fact that I have it is just almost strange to me. And this was kind of when I started wanting this deck, this is kind of when it clicked for me that something had shifted. And I was surprised at myself with the Next World and the Sasuraibito, but I still kind of, as I said, there was still a tiny element of fantasy to those two. So I suppose I thought that these were just really special decks, which they are, but I thought kind of like a bit of an exception to the rule. But when it turns into 3 decks, and especially with this deck, which is an autobiographical depiction of an experience in New York City. Like, there's not this, I mean, it's still storytelling, right? And it's still artwork, but it's not, it is supposed to feel realistic, you know, to a certain extent. It's supposed to depict very real experiences. It's supposed to portray very real locations, and feelings and relationships and connections. This isn't a fantasy at all. And so when I was drawn to this deck, a deck that I had seen before, because it is my friend Annika from Nobody Hears, one of, if not her favourite deck, the deck that she really connects with and identifies with. And I remember watching her videos of it and thinking that the colours were beautiful, and watching those videos because I love listening to her and her share, but not at all having the inkling that that was a deck for me. Like, I liked the colours, I thought it was beautiful, but didn't even cross my mind that this would be a deck that I would want, that I would get, and that I would use. And cards like this, the Four of Cups, totally, this would be the sort of thing that would be an absolute deal breaker for me. Even if the rest of the deck was totally fantasy and cartoony and something like this showed up, even if it was in a more fantasy cartoon style, but this image, this concept showed up, I would probably be like, oh, okay, not for me then. And not in a dismissive way, just in a realistic understanding what it was that I wanted from my decks way. But now I look at this and I'm pulled into a very specific feeling and experience and memory. And I think I appreciate that in a way that I didn't before. And I think maybe it's just my connection with tarot has changed in itself as well in terms of how I read. I think previously I was a little bit more focused on the structure of tarot, and you know, what I'd learned about tarot, and I think that's great, and I love that I still have that. But I think recently I've just kind of, I don't know, something shifted for me in that I'm not as focused on that anymore. I am a lot more just on the feeling that the card gives me, and feeling is a really, really great way into a message. For me now, where it really wasn't as much before. And I think that's part of why I'm now exploring other decks that I've always liked the look of, but never, just they weren't for me once upon a time, and now they are. And one was the Idiosyncradeck. Is it supposed to be pronounced like Idiosyncradeck? But it's deck. I don't know how we're supposed to pronounce this. I know that the word idiosyncratic is pronounced a certain way, but the deck throws me off. Anyway, this deck that I mean, it's very cartoony, this deck, but it's still, a lot of it's really quite, you know, real worldy, modern imagery, especially in the cups. Like these very, very, like, this. I remember seeing this once upon a time when this deck was, you know, still in print, and just being like, it's cute, I love the image, but I just wouldn't want to read with that. Whereas now, I see this and it makes me emotional. Like, this deck is just incredible, and I connect with it so much more now, and I connect with it very strongly and personally now. And I think that's really the thing that's going on here, is that I've allowed myself to connect my own really intimate personal experiences with specific cards, and I love when a card just opens this door into, you know, kind of like this time trip down memory lane, or into, you know, some very specific experience that I've had, or feeling that an experience has brought up in me. Before, I was more wanting to know what something meant, whereas now I relish that experience of what something feels like, what something reminds me of, and the lessons in that experience, as opposed to the lessons of an archetype in a card. I don't know if that makes sense, but that distinction has really shifted for me in a really interesting and surprising way. And so all of this is really exciting. I'm really enjoying this whole shift. It's opened me up to decks that I just didn't think were for me, like the Urban Tarot, like the Idiosyncradeck, and I'm now on the lookout for a copy of the Gaian Tarot, which again was a deck that I've always thought was pretty, but just didn't think was for me. It's exciting. being opened up to all of these decks and experiencing all of these decks and experiencing tarot in a new way. But equally, it's kind of been a bit of a grieving process in some ways, and I certainly have had some resistance to it. And not just because I thought these weren't decks for me, but also because it means that I'm connecting less with some really true, tried old favorites of mine. So decks that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, decks like the Watersprite and the Hezicos Tarot, they genuinely are some of my most loved and used decks. And yet I haven't touched them in about a year. The Hezicos, I think, is especially heartbreaking to me, and I don't know that I'm ready to completely let go of it, but it has been really surprising to me how I just haven't been drawn to use it. And I am still drawn to using some Fairytale cutesy decks, but they are very, very Rider-Waite-Smith, and it's almost just like this playfulness that they bring, like the Little Monsters or the Mons Tarot and the Crystal Unicorn Tarot. Like, it's this cheesy, fun thing that they bring. Whereas decks like the Watersprite and the Hezicos, they have an element of that, but they also had something else, something deeper, something richer that provided my proper, really meaningful readings. I'm not saying that the Little Monsters doesn't do that, but like, they were basically my go-to tried and true, you know, all-rounder decks, where they're not really anymore, which is kind of hard for me to accept that these decks that I love, I don't want to say loved, because I still love them. It's just that I don't use them. It's kind of like, I remember hearing this saying and not understanding it when I was younger, was that you can still love someone without being in love with them anymore. And that's kind of how I feel about these decks, that I love them, I think they're beautiful, and I appreciate so deeply the relationship that we had, but we just don't connect in the same way. We've grown apart. It's not you, it's me. And it's strange and hard to accept. And also, I suppose part of the reason I wanted to share this with you was just sharing, because that's what I do on this channel, and exploring it for myself, but also because I've had a lot of questions about, you know, certain decks that I used to speak about a lot and that I don't really talk about much anymore. And I think there's some confusion there. You know, decks like the Hezicos Tarot that I've said is one of my favorite decks and that I use a lot and that I've done a review on, and the Watersprite Tarot I've said before is one of the most underrated decks. All of that is true. I was not lying when I said those things. I 100% meant them, and I stand by those things that I said about how great these decks are. The only thing that has changed is me and what I'm doing in my tarot practice, what I'm trying to achieve in my tarot practice, and what my tarot practice is giving me. And so I think it's interesting that I have found that, you know, when I start to kind of break up with a deck, and not in like a bad way, just in a, I haven't used for you for a while and it's time to move on. There's always some people who I think are upset with me, and I suppose it's just a bit of confusion, but they're upset and I think they feel like I've lied or that I was lying. And I just think it's important, I want to share that it's not true. It's just that things have changed, and that's okay. Like, it's okay for people to change what it is they like and to change their minds on things. And it's not, I didn't make a review and lie. I'm 100% honest in my reviews. I'm really passionate and I care deeply about, you know, the integrity of my reviews and the integrity of my voice. But also, and also, not but, and things have changed for me recently. These decks aren't doing what they used to for me. And that's not because what I said wasn't true. It's not because those decks aren't amazing. It's not because I wouldn't even recommend those decks anymore. I still would, because I know how much value they gave to me. It's simply that I'm in a different place and different decks are giving me value now. So I'm not saying that I'm getting rid of all of my collection. I definitely am having a think about what decks are worth holding on for me at the moment. Although I'm aware that I don't know how long, you know, maybe I'll shift again. I don't know. But at this stage, I definitely do feel like there are some decks that aren't being used, and I feel like they should be. That I don't feel comfortable with them sitting on my shelf and taking up space when, you know, these decks are made to be used and to be loved, and I'm not doing that. So if you see a bunch of my decks coming up for sale or trade soon, please know it's not because I lied. Please know it's not because I was making stuff up, or because these decks, you know, I've completely had a change of heart and now I've decided that they're not good. It's just, I've changed, and I'm trying to express and explore why that is or what that means. But this is as articulate as I can be at this moment, because I think I'm still in that process. But it is something I've definitely been able to reflect on, and I've realized, I've witnessed that this is definitely something that's happening, whether I like it or not, regardless of how much I've tried to resist it. If you've had a similar experience, I would so love to hear from you, because I am, as excited as I am, I'm also a little bit conflicted, and still I'm still a little bit sad. So if you've had a similar experience, please share with me. And I would love to hear, you know, kind of how that worked out for you. Was it a short-term thing, or did it really kind of revolutionize long-term the way that you approach tarot? And I hope this video turns out interesting. It's certainly been useful to kind of explore this for myself. And it's interesting the journeys that we go on with tarot, life in general, but with tarot. And we often end up going down very surprising detours or new tracks entirely. I don't know, it's been an interesting journey this past year, really. About a year. I got the Sasuraibito I think in October last year, and then the next world in January this year. So it's been a pretty relatively recent thing, and kind of like the big culmination of it all has happened in the last 6 months or so. But I suppose that is all from me for now. Thank you so much for watching and listening to my little ramble. I hope you're all well, and I will talk to you again soon. So much love. Bye.